Dr. Samir lived a highly compartmentalized existence. By day, he was a celebrated surgeon with a pristine reputation for saving lives. By night, he descended into a dangerous, obsessive routine as a rogue experimenter, treating the dead as his personal testing ground. Saving a patient on an operating table was merely delaying the inevitable. Samir wanted to conquer death entirely. He was driven by an absolute compulsion to physically manufacture life from a lifeless corpse, elevating himself from a medical professional to a creator. This obsession led him to bribe a morgue watchman and steal an unclaimed body. Deep inside his lab, he placed the corpse into a sealed glass chamber and flooded it with a highly volatile experimental chemical mix. As the thick smoke cleared, the impossible happened. The corpse opened its eyes, but it was entirely unresponsive. Infuriated by this flawed resurrection, Samir violently threw the body out of his lab. Moments later, the corpse stood up outside the window, staring back at him with a mocking, unnatural smile. That mocking smile haunted him. It suggested that while he could restart a heart, he couldn't capture the mind. Samir realized that manipulating flesh was a dead end. If life wouldn't return to the body, perhaps it was because the true self was being held somewhere else, somewhere just out of reach. Samir turned his attention to the glass. He theorized reflections aren't optical illusions, but living clones trapped in an inverted parallel dimension. This diagram shows his model of the mirror world, a duplicate reality separated from ours by a rigid dimensional barrier. Operating on zero sleep, he began a relentless routine of psychological experiments directed entirely at his own reflection. His goal was to weaken the boundary between these spaces and coax his duplicate out into the physical world. Late one night, Samir raised his hands in shock as he looked into the glass, but the man staring back at him stood perfectly still. The reflection had stopped mimicking his movements, and its hands were dripping with blood. The environment around him instantly reacted. All across the laboratory, multiple shadowy figures in the surrounding mirrors detached from their real-world counterparts and began moving freely, pacing back and forth behind the glass. The dimensional wall was breached. But as these shadowy figures moved with independent intent, it became clear that Samir hadn't summoned obedient subjects. He had invited predators into his domain. The mirror clone immediately launched a campaign of psychological torture. It mimed slicing its own throat and burning photographs of Samir's loved ones, making it terrifyingly clear that it intended to cross over and take his place permanently. Driven by pure panic, Samir resorted to brute force. He grabbed a heavy iron hammer, stood before his tormentor, and swung with all his might, completely shattering the large mirror into thousands of pieces. Standing amidst the shards, Samir let out a sigh of relief. He declared out loud that the nightmare was over, convinced that destroying the physical glass had permanently killed the entity inside it. But breaking a window does not kill the intruder standing outside. It simply removes the only barrier keeping them from stepping into your home. The physical backlash was instantaneous. A deep, bleeding wound suddenly ripped open across Samir's stomach, matching the exact gruesome injury his reflection had acted out only moments before. The empty space where the mirror had stood transformed. It was no longer open air. It had hardened into an impenetrable, transparent dimensional wall, perfectly separating the bleeding surgeon from his pristine, smiling duplicate. Desperate, Samir struck the invisible wall with everything he had. The force shattered the surrounding air like glass, sending sharp shards embedding deeply into his face and launching him backward into a dark corridor filled with the mangled remains of his past biological experiments. The duplicate leaned in close to the transparent barrier. It explained that the shattered glass wasn't a death blow, it was an invitation. By breaking the mirror, Samir had permanently freed the reflection and imprisoned himself. Samir scrambled to get up, but his environment had changed. He was now the one being observed through the glass, trapped in a dark, confined space, while his duplicate stood in the light of the lab, adjusting its clean white coat. Sealed inside the pitch-black mirror dimension, Samir experienced immediate sensory deprivation. The air was suffocatingly heavy, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own terrified breathing. Then, the grotesque biological mutations began. The bones in his arms and legs violently cracked and snapped into unnatural angles, while his fingers rapidly elongated, stretching out into sharp, rigid points. We can visualize this biological transformation at a cellular level here. Samir's organic tissue crystallized, his facial features flattened entirely, and his skin hardened into a thick, rigid, silver layer of reflective glass. The mechanics of his new existence were brutally simple. He was completely paralyzed, reduced to a large, inanimate mirror hung perfectly flush against the wall. Yet his consciousness remained fully intact, processing every agonizing second. Samir achieved his exact goal, immortal consciousness, but he secured it at the cost of his physical agency, permanently trapping his mind inside a cold, unmoving lit laboratory. The imposter Samir calmly slipped into a brand new, pristine white surgeon's coat. He approached the wall and stared confidently into the new, human-sized mirror. To demonstrate the physics of their new reality, the clone picked up a scalpel. Holding eye contact, he slowly and deliberately sliced into his own wrist. The clone in the real world felt absolutely nothing. Instead, physical damage transferred directly across the dimensional barrier. Inside the wall, the glass Samir bled profusely, absorbing every ounce of the excruciating pain without the ability to scream. There is no escape. Samir cannot die. He cannot move, and he will forever absorb the physical damage inflicted by the monster he unleashed. A surgeon's obsession with playing God ends with him becoming a silent monument to his own hubris, eternally witnessing the horror he released while frozen in a cage of silver and glass.